This is BBC One in the South. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Alan Sinclair.
Day one of the campaign and the leaders fire the first salvos. Blair's 5 new pledges and a big hint tonight on tax. A parting Commons spat as Hague says Blair wants to ditch the pound. Armed police on London streets are terrorists plotting campaign violence. New tension on the West Bank after 2 Jewish teenagers are found stoned to death.
In the south, huge losses for the tourism industry as attractions count the cost of the foot and mouth outbreak. And a lucky escape, residents in this South Sea hotel are led to safety as it begins to collapse.
Good evening. 30 days from polling day and the party machines are up and running. Labour produced its newest pledge card. The Tories opened the poster war and the Liberal Democrats attacked them both, but the Tories most. In the Commons, there was a final set-to between the party leaders, with William Hague accusing Tony Blair of plotting to take Britain into the euro. Tonight, the Prime Minister talked about income tax and hinted that Labour would keep the top rate where it is. John Pienaar watched the day unfold.
The phony war's over, and now the campaigning's for real. Carefully choreographed, of course, but Tony Blair is getting on with the business of defining the party he wants to lead into a second term. Tonight, the emphasis is on public services, but with a clear hint that Middle Britain won't be confronted with higher income tax bills, despite the pressure in the party for the better off to pay more.
Many people who support us strongly might like us to change some of the tax rates at the top, but I actually believe the best thing that we can do is offer real opportunity at the bottom. That's what I believe.
Labour's pledge card, published today, makes no promises on tax, but on the economy it does promise low mortgages and low inflation. On schools, 10,000 extra teachers are promised, and on health, 20,000 extra nurses and 10,000 extra doctors. In the fight against crime, 6,000 extra police are offered, and for families, pensioners' fuel payments would stay, and there'd be a £4.20 minimum wage. Today, the Tory leader was out parodying Labour's last set of promises. All spin, no substance, he claimed, remote from reality and Labour's real agenda. In the last Commons confrontation before the election, William Hague attacked on Europe and the euro. He wanted the Prime Minister to eat the words that he helpfully quoted.
He said, "I know exactly what the British people feel when they see the Queen's head on a £10 note. I feel it too. There are emotional issues involved in the single currency. It's about the sovereignty of Britain." Wasn't his emotional exploitation of the Queen's head before the last election just like his emotional exploitation of school children at this election? And why doesn't he actually come clean, be straight with people and admit that he wants to ditch the pound as soon as he can get away with it?
Should we recommend to people that we join the single currency, then of course the people will have the final say in a referendum. What we should not do as a country is isolate and marginalise ourselves in Europe when 3 million jobs in this country depend on Europe. And as for schools, let me remind him that it is this government that have cut class sizes for 5, 6 and 7-year-olds.
The Tory leader's parting shot, a denial that he was running away from a debate on public services. Just the opposite.
He said things could only get better, but secondary school class sizes are the highest for 25 years. Hospital waiting lists are up. The asylum system is in chaos. The transport system is at a standstill. Violent crime has soared. The rights and powers of our country are being given away. Why does he need a second chance to be all spin and no delivery?
The Lib Dem leader's taken to the air. He'll visit 11 towns over 3 days. Charles Kennedy is arguing that higher taxes may be the only way to fund public services properly. It's a message he believes could catch on.
When people are asked, how would you vote if you thought the Liberal Democrats could win here? If you look at it on a national basis, the way that works out, it means that we would win over 200 seats at this general election. So that's the potential that's there for the party at this election.
At a meeting with Labour MPs today, the Prime Minister appealed to his parliamentary troops to campaign passionately on the issues that divide Labour from the Tories. Tonight, the dividing lines are clear on Europe, on public spending and on tax. But it's also clear that Tony Blair is as keen as ever to appeal to Middle Britain. And that'll disappoint those in the party who believed they had more freedom to set their own terms for the coming election. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Europe was catapulted to the top of the political agenda by the Tories, with William Hague's rallying cry for a last-ditch stand to save the pound. The issue of the euro is likely to be raised time and time again in the election campaign, as Peter Morgan reports.
Within the year, a dozen proud European currencies will be rounded up and shoveled into furnaces as new euro notes and coins enter circulation. During the next Parliament, the British may decide whether the pound sterling should disappear from the high streets and be consigned to history alongside the French franc and the Deutschmark. It's a momentous political and economic decision and the single issue upon which the major parties are most profoundly divided.
We have to take this election as though it were our last chance to vote to keep the pound. And the only way we can be sure of keeping the pound is by voting Conservative.
Well, Liberal Democrats believe this is a debate that needs to be had. Let's get it over and done with in a referendum once the election's been held. And the question for the Conservative Party is why they won't let the British people decide.
The battleground of the euro debate has already been staked out. The Conservatives rule out British membership during the next Parliament. The Liberal Democrats would join as soon as a realistic exchange rate for entry could be reached. That would mean a sharp devaluation of the pound. Labour would decide within 2 years if Britain would benefit from membership. If so, it'd hold a referendum. Labour will apply 5 economic tests of whether joining the euro will create more jobs and help the economy grow. But there's no disguising the fact that the decision to join or not is fundamentally political.
The divide at this election will be between a party like ours that is in favour of being part of Europe but will judge the single currency on what's best for Britain, and therefore we take a pragmatic and common sense view, as against a Conservative party that takes a wholly dogmatic view and would leave Britain completely isolated in Europe, which is not in the interest of British jobs and British business.
The British public tell pollsters they're adamantly opposed to joining the euro, which explains why William Hague is so keen on the issue and describes the scale of the challenge a re-elected Tony Blair will face if he's to call and win a referendum on euro membership. Peter Morgan, BBC News.
2 new opinion polls are being published tomorrow. The Mori poll for The Times, carried out yesterday, shows Labour at 54%, the Conservatives at 30%, and the Lib Dems at 13%. The Gallup poll for The Telegraph shows Labour at 49%, the Conservatives at 32%, and the Lib Dems at 13%. It was carried out over the course of the last week. Taken with the other 2 polls this week, the figures are in line with the findings over the last 3 months, all showing a consistently strong Labour lead. Well, we're joined now from Westminster by our political editor, Andrew Marr. Andrew, on Labour's pledge card, there's nothing about income tax, but Tony Blair tonight appears to have written one in. Now, are we seeing policy here being made on the hoof, or was it all cleared in advance with the Chancellor?
It would have been cleared, it was cleared in advance with the Chancellor. There's no way that Tony Blair would make that kind of statement without doing so. Nevertheless, it seems to have been one of the very last things to have been nailed down in Labour's election manifesto discussions. There's no secret that the very powerful voices in the Treasury and elsewhere in the party have been saying, listen, if we're going to have to raise taxes at some point, the obvious thing is to raise the top rate of income tax. That's the fair way to do it. The Liberal Democrats would like to raise it to 50p. So, let's give ourselves the wriggle room, the elbow room to do that and not have to go back to more stealth taxes. But Tony Blair has overruled that. Very interesting, because this pledge card here, it is in a sense their flexible friend, because some of the commitments on it, like mortgages as low as possible, are relatively flexible, and the rest are spending pledges. So you would expect something on tax and tax rates, but it's not on this card. It is going to be on the manifesto. The card, of course, was printed first. Now, I think this is very interesting, because if Tony Blair is exerting himself to put his own vision, if you like, the Middle Britain vision, which is not held quite so clearly by the Chancellor and others. He's kind of more the Daily Mail man, if you like. They're more the Daily Mirror people. Then that shows a Prime Minister unbound. And I think that's also the case when it comes to Europe.
Just briefly, Andrew, in this early grappling to set the agenda for the campaign, Mr Hague went very strong on saving the pound today. Does he think that could be a winner for them?
He certainly does. We saw Tony Blair also determined to campaign about Europe, but the pound is going to be central to the Conservatives' ideas for the campaign, as of course will tax, because the other thing that we're going to hear tomorrow when the Conservatives launch their manifesto is their tax ideas. They're talking about 6p off a litre on petrol and diesel in their first budget if they're re-elected. That would cost about £2.2 billion and finish their tax plans, which will in turn be attacked by Labour. We were saying last night that this election is going to be all about Europe and tax and spend. And I have to say, 24 hours later, that's exactly how it feels.
Andrew Marr, thank you. And Newsnight, starting on BBC Two at 10:30, will be taking a closer look at Labour's election pledges. Anti-terrorist officers say the real IRA is planning to escalate its bombing attacks in an attempt to disrupt the general election campaign. Police in London are on a state of high alert with more armed officers patrolling the streets, and Scotland Yard is warning that the country is now in a period of danger. Our crime correspondent Stephen Cape has been given exclusive access to the unit trying to stop the terrorists.
Armed police on the streets of London. In this atmosphere of heightened security, even innocent motorists like this man are being stopped as the search for the real IRA bombers is stepped up. Based on intelligence, officers know what they're looking for: maps, notes on reconnaissance and bomb-making equipment. Anything which suggests the terrorists are preparing another attack on mainland Britain.
We're checking on any vehicle or any person that looks suspicious to us. We've actually created a sterile area here, and we'll bring them into the sterile controlled area, check them out, and if there's no problem, release them.
BBC cameras were allowed into the heart of the anti-terrorist branch. No one can be identified. Here, officers analyse all the intelligence. They know that battlefield weaponry and explosives have been smuggled into the UK from Eastern Europe. And Scotland Yard fears the bombing campaign will become more intense as the general election approaches.
This is a period of danger. For the terrorists, this represents a stage in which all of the political antennae are acute. There is a guarantee of publicity during the weeks ahead. The trend is worrying.
It was a terrorist bomb planted in a taxi outside the BBC, which damaged the reception area just over 2 months ago. The security forces fear the same tactic will be used again. The anti-terrorist branch is sifting through thousands of closed-circuit television tapes in the hopes of pinpointing members of the real IRA. They have suspect images, but the quality is not good enough to make a firm identification. Intelligence officers believe the terrorist cell in London could consist of former members of the Provisional IRA and new recruits. They could even sound English.
We've seen Irish Republican terrorists operate in England, both in small cells and in units of 8 and as many perhaps as 10. Indeed, in 1998, we arrested a cell of 3 real IRA terrorists in London. It's also likely, of course, that as in the past, there may be some kind of logistical support here also, for example, such as a safe house.
Firearms officers are briefed before going out on armed patrol, well aware that the next person they stop could be a terrorist.
The strategic intentions of the operation are to deter and disrupt any persons intent on committing acts of terrorism.
Throughout Britain, there are also contingency plans in place to deal with possible terrorist attacks. Armed police on this scale have not been seen on the streets for many years. It's an indication of just how seriously the anti-terrorist branch is taking the threat of further bomb attacks. Stephen Cape, BBC News, Central London.
And there's more on the election later in the programme, but first, the rest of the day's news. The Israeli government says it will track down one by one the killers of 2 Jewish teenagers who were stoned to death near their homes in the West Bank. The police believe the boys were murdered by Palestinians. The Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said he held the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat responsible for the killings.
The overnight search ended with a grim discovery at dawn. The missing boys had been to caves near their homes, a favourite spot for local children. They had been attacked, beaten to death with stones, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The families of Yakov Mandel and Yusuf Ishran believe they died in a racist attack by Arabs. Tensions in the area have been running high for months. Still, the mother of one of the dead boys told me the family is not leaving.
And I will stay here.
Despite everything.
This is our land, and this is Israel. Don't forget it.
For the thousands of Jewish families who've made their homes on occupied Palestinian territory, this is the biblical land of Judea and Samaria. Many see this country as theirs by the will of God. But the International Mitchell Commission's inquiry into the violence here suggests the ongoing expansion of settlements could be an obstacle to peace. It says there should be no more building. The Israeli Prime Minister rejects that, saying that there will be no new settlements, but that those already built must be allowed to expand to take in what he calls the natural growth of settler families. Prime Minister, the Mitchell Commission has asked Israel to stop building new homes in the settlements. Why can't you agree to this gesture at this time?
We are not building new communities, but now to try, I mean, what's going to happen there? They should live, let's say, 3 generations in 2 small rooms.
And so the settlement expansion goes on. For the Palestinians, each new Jewish home is a further outrage. They demand that the Israelis stop the building.
The solution lies in the political context, lies in ending settlement activities, lies in implementing the total Mitchell report.
And so it's clear that Jewish settlements built on occupied Palestinian land are emerging as the key issue in this conflict. And as long as neither side is ready to compromise, there can be no return to peace negotiations. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Here, the trial at the Old Bailey of Barry George, the man accused of murdering Jill Dando, has heard from witnesses who saw a man near the murder scene before the television presenter was shot. 2 of them later identified him as the 41-year-old defendant. Mr. George denies the murder charge.
At 7 o'clock on the morning Jill Dando was shot, Susan Mays, another resident of Gowan Avenue, saw a man standing by a car opposite Jill Dando's house. Miss Mays told the court that the man seemed nervous and tried to shield his face. It was obvious, she said, that he did not want to be seen. The court was shown pictures of a video identification parade at which Miss Mays had identified the defendant as the man she had seen. She was, she said, very sure of her identification. Another witness, Helen Scott, described how the evening before the shooting she'd been at the junction of Gowan Avenue and Fulham Palace Road, where for nearly 5 minutes she'd watched a man gazing up Gowan Avenue. She said the man had crossed the road as she'd approached. At a video identification parade 20 months after the murder, the court heard how Miss Scott had narrowed her choice to 2 people on the parade, number 8 and number 2. She finally chose number 8. The defendant was number 2. A third witness, Terry Normanton, told how she'd seen a man she'd identified as the defendant outside Jill Dando's house shortly before 10 o'clock on the morning of the murder. But the defence said it had taken Miss Normanton a year to come forward with her account, and the defendant's counsel, Michael Mansfield QC, suggested that she had made a mistake. The trial continues. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Old Bailey.
Around 200 owners of rural businesses have staged a protest outside Downing Street to demand more government help for areas hit by foot and mouth disease. They've been promised assistance worth £24 million, but the protesters claim the epidemic has cost the rural economy billions. Tests are being carried out on children and staff at a nursery at Wandsworth in southwest London after a teacher collapsed with tuberculosis. 25 youngsters aged between 2 and 5 and 5 staff are known to have been exposed to the disease. Protests by residents in Pembrokeshire have managed to stop plans to grow a trial crop of genetically modified maize on a local farm. The The protesters say they're worried that nearby crops may be contaminated, but the owner of the farm, who's a former Tory MP, says the government is to blame for sending out mixed messages about GM crop trials.
Having given up on traditional agriculture, for the last 4 years, Gerald Miles has been nurturing a successful business as an organic farmer. But like many others in the area, he was deeply worried that his hard-won commercial advantages would be lost if customers suspected cross-contamination of crops and feed from the planned genetically modified trial.
What we produce on this farm is pork, and we produce milk as well. We can't, after that trial would start, we can't call it GM-free. You know, we would lose that status.
There have been regular and vociferous protests in several Pembrokeshire communities ever since the former Tory MP, Tony Marlow, announced his intention to plant GM maize on his farm. Having now abandoned that plan, he and his partners accuse the government of sending out mixed messages on the issue.
Unfortunately, many conventional farmers have been led to believe that their commercial crops and their livestock products could be put at risk by us proceeding with this GM maize trial. And this isn't true, but it's very difficult to disprove it.
Mr Marlowe's land, like 150 other farm-scale evaluations around the UK, was set up 2 years ago under an agreement between the government and the biotech industry. A year ago, the Welsh Assembly voted to declare Wales a GM-free zone, even though it doesn't actually have the power to pursue or to implement such a policy. But now the combination of political and, moreover, local pressure has succeeded in bringing this trial to an end. Rita Davis, BBC News, Pembrokeshire.
New DNA technology is having a massive impact on solving crime. With police carrying out more and more tests on suspects, the national database holding the samples is expanding rapidly. Our Home Affairs correspondent Margaret Gilmore investigates how it's solving crimes, both old and new.
It happened in broad daylight in Glasgow. CCTV pictures show a gun is drawn on a passer-by. But plainclothes police were on the trail. The gunman was arrested. DNA tests linked him to 2 armed robberies. Science is linking people to crimes as never before.
The significance of DNA lies in the fact that it will be able to connect crimes such as housebreaking, break-ins to cars, vandalism, even fraud, to identify those responsible for those crimes.
Here, police scientists investigating crimes search for particles which identify the DNA or unique genetic code of a criminal. A decade ago, they needed blood or stains the size of a 2-pence piece. Now, a particle smaller than a pinhead will do.
Never has science been so powerful in solving crime. Tests on a single hair can show if you've been taking drugs months earlier. But it's new DNA technology that's bringing the biggest change. Here in the Strathclyde area, it's already having a dramatic effect.
They've started testing the DNA of nearly everyone they arrest. 95 crimes were solved the first month. When Laura Donnelly was murdered, hundreds of men were tested. DNA from Thomas Brophy identified him as the killer.
What it did do was the fact that he wasn't going to do it again to anybody else and put them through what we had been through, and the fact that I could actually get into the town centre again without fear of being in the same area as him.
It's not just modern crime. Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were murdered 27 years ago. Small traces of DNA were discovered at the scene near Swansea. They've been kept for 3 decades. Only now can new technology extract the tiny amount of DNA found. This could finally solve the crime. Up to 1,000 men are now having swabs taken to identify their DNA and see if it matches.
We don't have to do particularly a reinvestigation of the inquiry, but merely track down, find, locate individuals mentioned from 1973 and buccal swab them for profiles.
Murders like these could be resolved, but the technology means many more lesser crimes will be solved too. Civil rights groups argue DNA testing of suspects can infringe their liberty. Police say it's an increasingly effective tool in fighting crime. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
Now football, and Bayern Munich have gone through to the final of the Champions League after they beat Real Madrid 2-1 on the night and 3-1 overall. Their first came in the 8th minute when Giovanni Elber reacted quickest during a goalmouth scramble. Real Madrid equalised within 10 minutes when Luis Figo swept in a near-post cross. But the deciding goal came from Jens Jeremies in a well-worked set piece from a free kick. In the final, Bayern will meet Valencia, who knocked out Leeds last night. Harry Redknapp, the manager of West Ham United, has decided to stand down as the club's manager. He said it was time for a change, admitting he hadn't enjoyed being in charge of the club during the past few weeks. West Ham's future in the Premiership was made certain only at the weekend. His assistant, Frank Lampard Sr., has also left the club. Now, more on the election, and if you're already thinking there's nothing new in the campaign, you're wrong. For the first time ever, the internet is being used in an attempt to get people to vote tactically. A number of websites are trying to persuade people to change their normal voting habits in seats which their party is unlikely to win. One of the target areas is East Sussex, where voters in the neighbouring marginals of Labour-controlled Brighton Kemp Town and Liberal Democrat-run Lewis are being encouraged to switch votes in order to see off the Conservative challenge.
When it's a sunny day, this bit of Brighton is a target for tourists. When it's polling day, it's a target for tactical voters. Voters like Cyril Claydon. With the help of a new website, he's hoping to keep out the Tories. This is how vote swapping on the internet works. It's a little like a dating agency. Cyril is mature, greying and Labour. But in Lewis, he believes they have no hope, so he'll vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats. In return, the website has paired him up with Georgette in the next-door seat of Brighton Kemp Town. She's young, a student, Lib Dem. She doesn't want to throw away her vote either, so in an online bargain with Cyril, she's agreed to vote Labour.
If I do it tactically, then my choice is still counted as a Liberal Democrat supporter, because another voter will take my vote and I'll take his. So I still get my say and I still make my vote.
Like so much else here, we have the Americans to thank for the idea of tactical voting via the web.
Once the internet has started giving people the information they need, then the genie is out of the bottle. Why is somebody going to go back to blindly voting out of party loyalty when they've seen the results of tactical voting, which created so many more Lib Dem and Labour MPs at the last election? You can't turn the clock back.
The pop singer and political activist Billy Bragg has also started up a website for vote swapping, this time in Dorset. He admits there's nothing to stop people promising to vote for someone else's party and then failing to do so.
It has to be taken on trust. And in the end, you have to look at the way things are in your own parliamentary constituency and see what you think would be best to do. The alternative, frankly, is to be apathetic and not bother to vote.
Tactical voting certainly played a part in the last election, but some analysts believe this time round it'll be less important, and they doubt that many will abandon their traditional allegiances to vote swap.
People aren't very well organized, and a lot of people believe very strongly that the vote is a very precious thing, and they wouldn't dream of fiddling the system. So I'm pretty skeptical.
The idea of online tactical voting has been imported from overseas, but now that it's in Britain, will it catch on? Well, with the web still expanding rapidly, the chances are that it is here to stay. Ben Brown, BBC News, Brighton.
Two of the country's best-known and longest-serving MPs retire from the Commons this week. Tony Benn and the former Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath have decided not to fight this election. They've been on opposite sides in the House of Commons for more than half a century, but they're agreed on one thing: Parliament is being undermined, and with it, Britain's democracy.
Parliament is about to dissolve. The tide carries another generation of MPs away. Tonight, at a reception for retiring members in the Speaker's rooms, men and women who arrived here many years ago, young, fresh-faced, optimistic, were saying goodbye.
You're not going into the House of Lords, nor John Major.
Retiring commoners like Tony Benn and Sir Edward Heath don't fancy Tony Blair's appointed second chamber. A few hours earlier, William Hague and Tony Blair lavished praise on these suddenly lovable old war horses. But Sir Edward, in his last speech as Father of the House, was characteristically sharp about Parliament's decline in recent years.
I cannot help but be saddened by the increasing impotence of this House and the decline in the the decline in the esteem in which this place is held, speaking quite frankly. The powers of Parliament to hold the executive to account have been declining for over a century.
He should know for half that century he's watched it happen. Like Tony Benn, he was first elected at the 1950 general election, entering a Commons still dominated by Churchill and Attlee. In the old days, politicians, like the young Tony Benn, campaigned by tramping the streets, and if they got elected, revelled in a Commons where the ideologies clashed. A different world.
Prime Minister's Questions is the biggest switch-off ever. I dozed off the other day during Prime Minister's Questions, unbelievably. Power has shifted, and the people who are really interested in politics now, outside, have no connection with the parliamentary process.
Though Mr Benn was a Labour cabinet minister in the 60s and 70s, while Sir Edward Heath rose to be the Tory Prime Minister who took Britain into Europe, both fell out with their party leaderships and political fashions. But Sir Edward can sound just as sardonic about the Commons under Tony Blair.
It's question time in the House now. His own people seem to ask nothing but